what are we going to learn today? So we're going to be learning the proper data format for a pivot table. So the number one step is your data has to be in a certain structure. So we're going to be going through a checklist of what to look for in your data to make sure that you're going to be able to use a pivot table with it. Then we're going to be looking at inserting a pivot table and using Excel tables in conjunction with those pivot tables. And that's going to make updating pivot tables a lot easier down the road. Then we're going to look at how to use the pivot table fields list. So the command center for building out your pivot tables, we're going to look at that, figure out what all that stuff in there does and is for. And after we have a pivot table built, we're going to look at formatting the numbers and adding a little bit of style elements to our pivot tables, make them look a little bit nicer. And then we're going to summarize by different methods. So by default, the pivot table is going to sum up your data, but we're going to learn how to change that so that we can count and take minimums and maximums and averages and other different types of aggregation methods. Then we're going to add in some slicers to our pivot tables and connect them to multiple pivot tables. So slicers are user-friendly ways of filtering down your data and pivot tables, and they're great for building dashboards. So we'll take a look at those. And then we're going to be adding and customizing pivot charts. So once we've got pivot tables, we're going to basically visualize them into pivot charts. And once we've got all those tools under our belt, we're going to take everything that we learn and we're going to build an interactive and dynamic dashboard with all of those tools. All right, so that's a lot to cover. So I'm going to head over to Excel and let's get started. In this webinar, we're going to be taking a look at some HR data. So here we've got a set of employee records. And if we take a look at it real quickly, you can see it's got 12 columns of data. And if I scroll down a little bit to the end, we've got 1,471 rows of data, and that includes our column headings. So 1,470 rows of actual data. And let's take a quick look at what we actually have in here. So we can see that we've got an employee ID, their age, gender, marital status, some fields about their education, and what department and what job role they have at the company, and the date they started, and then a couple metrics here about how long they've been working in total, and how many years at the company they've been working, and their monthly salary. Now we're going to be working with HR data, but whether you're in HR or accounting or finance, whatever your data, pivot tables are going to be a great tool for analyzing it. But before you can start analyzing it with pivot tables, we need to make sure that it's in a certain format before we can even use pivot tables. And I'm not talking about formatting like font and font size and that kind of thing. What I mean is we need to make sure that the data is in a certain structure. So we need to kind of go through a checklist and make sure that we got the right structure of data first. So the first thing on our list is we need to make sure that our first row of data has column headers in it. So pivot tables are going to use the column headers to reference our data, and we need each column to have a column header in it. And we can see that our data, the first row here, has exactly that. So we got column headers in our first row. That looks okay. And we don't need to have those column headers in the first row of the sheet. We just need to have them in the first row of the data. So we could actually have something like this, like right click and insert. We could have some blank rows up there or whatever. We just need to have our first row of data be column headers. So let's just get rid of that anyways. Right click and delete that. Now the next thing we need to make sure that we have is no blanks in our column headings. So for example, if we had something here like this, nothing in that column heading, we wouldn't be able to use a pivot table. We need something in there to name our column. So I'm just going to press Control Z and undo that. The next thing we need to make sure is that we don't have any blank columns or blank rows. So a couple blank cells in our columns or rows is okay, but fully blank columns or rows is going to be a problem. So if we have something like this, if I right click and insert a column there. If you have something like that, you're going to need to get rid of that. So delete any blank columns. And same thing, if you have something like this, you need to get rid of your blank rows as well. So you can find them all and right click and delete them. Now next we need to make sure that we don't have any subtotals or grand totals in the data. So if you have something like this, I'm just going to right click and insert a row and just use the auto sum alt equals to sum up the cells above. If you have something like this, what's going to happen is your pivot table analysis is going to double count all the values here. So we're summing up these values right here, and this value here is going to come through into your pivot table analysis. And we don't want any of that kind of thing happening, so you need to get rid of any subtotals or grand totals. So you can find them and delete them. Next, we need to have one row in our data represent exactly one record. So for us, in our data set, each row represents the record for one employee, and that record doesn't spill into the next row or anything like that. It's all in one row. And lastly, we also need to have one column should represent exactly one type of data. So here in our job role column, everything below that pertains to the employee's job role, and no other type of data is in there. So that's it for the required format of our data. We need to have the first row as column headings. We can't have any blanks in our column headings, and we can't have any blank rows or columns. And we should get rid of any subtotals or grand totals, because those are potentially going to be double counted in our analysis if we leave them in. And we also need to have one row equal to one record in our data set, and one column should contain only one type of data. Now, before we create a pivot table with this data, what we're going to do is we're going to add it into an Excel table first. So an Excel table is basically a container for your data, and it has a lot of benefits. And one of them is if we ever eventually need to add data into our pivot table, it's going to make it a lot easier to update our pivot table with new data. So to create an Excel table, we just need to select any cell in our data and go up to the Insert tab and click on this Table command here. There's also a keyboard shortcut, so if you use Control-T, that's going to get you to this same Create Table dialog box. And now we have headers in our data. So our first row is headers, so we can keep that box checked there. And we just want to make sure that we've got the correct range here. So our data is in A1 to L1471. That's correct. And we can press OK. And we can immediately see that we've got an Excel table. So Excel tables, one of the benefits is it allows us to have different styling effects. And if we select our table and go up to our new Table Tools Design tab that appears when we have a table selected, one of the options here is that you can style your table. So if you click on here, there's many different options here, and you can pick any style you want. So there's light, medium, and dark themed options. And as you can see, when you hover over each option, you get a preview of that style in your workbook. So let's pick this blue theme here. But more importantly than adding style to your table, the first thing you're probably going to want to do is name your table. So Excel will give it a generic name, and if you go up into the Table Tools Design tab, you can see that it's been named Table 1 here, and we can just rename that easily to whatever we want. So let's call it maybe Employee Data, and press Enter. And now our table name is Employee Data instead of Table 1. So a couple other benefits of this table object. Notice that if we scroll down, our column headers are still visible. And also if we scroll down to the bottom, and up in our Table Tools Design tab, there's an option for a total row. So we can add in totals there if we want. Now let's just scroll back up to the top here. And I think we're ready to add in our first pivot table. So let's just again select any cell in our data or table now. And if we go up to the Insert tab, there's a command here, Pivot Tables. If we click on that, that's going to open up our Create Pivot Table dialog box. And you can see that there's two sections here, so it's going to ask us to choose the data that we want to analyze. And then it's going to ask us to choose where we want our pivot table report to be placed. So the first section here, we can see that Excel has selected our table name. And this is why it's important to use a table. So for example, if we hadn't used a table, we might have seen a range reference like this in there. And if we add data past that range reference, our pivot table isn't going to see it until we update our range reference. So if you add data and you're not using a table, you basically have to update your range reference as well. Whereas if you've got a table, you just add data to the table and refresh your pivot table without updating the range reference. And I'm just going to cancel out of this and go back to my Insert tab and Pivot Table command just so I get my employee data table name back there. Now the next section allows us to choose where we want to place our pivot table. So we can either have it in a new worksheet, and Excel is going to create a new worksheet and place our pivot table in there. Or we can select an existing worksheet and place it in there. So if we select that, that's going to give us the option to choose our location. And we can choose anywhere in our workbook. And once we're happy with that, we can press OK. And Excel is going to create a new blank pivot table for us. So here's our pivot table. It's got nothing in it right now. But as you'll see, my active cell cursor is inside this blank pivot table. And when it's inside there, I get two new objects in Excel up here. So I should get the Pivot Table Fields window. And I also get two new tabs up here. So Pivot Table Tools Analyze tab and the Design tab. Now, if you don't see the Pivot Table Fields window show up when you have your cell inside your pivot table, you can go up to the Analyze tab and there's an option here for Field List. If you click on that, it's going to hide it if it's there or show it if it's not there. The other thing is if you take your active cell cursor outside of your pivot table, then both the Pivot Table Fields List window goes away and those two tabs also disappear. But put your cursor back in there and those should reappear. Now let's take a closer look at our Pivot Table Fields window. So here we've got a list of all our fields in our data. And we can see that it goes from top to bottom in the same order that it goes in our data from left to right. So ID, age, gender, marital status. And if we take a look at our HR data, we got the same order here: ID, age, gender, marital status. Now we can also change that order if we want. So up here in the settings, we can change it so that it sorts alphabetically. Or we can go back and change it so it's sorted in the data source order. And there's a couple other options here that are worth checking out. So right now we got our Pivot Table Fields window set up, and it's got our fields list up here, and then it's got our 4 areas of our pivot table down here in a 2x2 grid. We can change that so that they're side by side, or we can just show certain sections of those. But I generally find that the default setting here is the best one. So we have our field list up here, and then down here, let's take a look at what we have here. So we've got 4 different areas. We've got a filters area, a columns area, a rows area, and a values area. Now these represent different areas in our pivot table, and these are areas that you can take fields from your field list and drag them into. And depending where you drag a field, it's going to do different things for your pivot table. So let's start out with the values area. And generally this is where you're going to want to add numerical based fields. So these are fields that you're going to want to summarize. So let's take a numerical field in our data. So monthly salary as an example. And if we click on it and drag it down and then release it into the values area, then we can see that we get sum of monthly sales listed here. And if we go into our pivot table and take a look at what's happened there, we end up with the sum of all the monthly salaries listed in our data. Now let's head back into our pivot table fields window and take a look at some of the other areas in our pivot table fields window. So let's take a look at the rows area here next. Now if we take a field, maybe let's take department, and if we click and drag that into the rows area, what we end up getting is all the items in our department field, so all the departments listed down that row. So essentially we've summarized our monthly salaries by each department. So here we've got human resources, and the total monthly salary in all the data is 419,000. And then for research and development department, we've got total monthly salaries of 6 million. And for our sales department, we've got total monthly salaries of 3.1 million. Now the columns area is pretty similar, but instead of listing items down the rows, we're going to be listing items in our field across the columns. So if we take something like our education level and add it to our columns area, we're going to get a listing of all the different education levels in our data across the columns here. So now we're summarizing our data by department and education level. And then we've got our total monthly salaries for each of those. So for example, in research and development department, our total monthly salaries for anyone with a bachelor's education is 2.35 million. Now I'm just going to move this pivot table down. So I'm just going to click and drag it down here, because our next area is the filters area. And when we add items to the filters area, we're going to get something up here. And I just happen to have something up here that was in the way. So I just wanted to avoid overwriting that. And now if we go back in here and add a field into our filters area, so let's try age. If we add that in there, we see that we get this field up here, age. And then there's a filter button right here that allows us to filter on all the different ages in our data. So we can select multiple items in there. And let's say we only want to look at our employees between the age of 20 and maybe 25. We can select those items and leave all the other ones unchecked and press OK. And now we've filtered our data selection down to just those age groups. And so now our pivot table is displaying, for example, people in the research and development department with a bachelor's degree and between the ages of 20 and 25. Their total salary spend on those are 65,000. Now with this pivot table fields window, you can see it's pretty easy to drag and drop things around. So you can take things from the columns area and maybe move them into the rows area. And now you're just looking at the same data but with a different view. So we've got our human resource department, and then within our human resource department we've got bachelor's and below college level employees. So basically just another view of our data, and you can do that with any of the fields here. So it's really easy to just drag fields around and explore your data that way. Now the other thing you might need to do with your pivot tables is remove fields from your pivot tables, and you can do that pretty easily by clicking on your field and dragging it outside of the pivot table fields window area, and that's going to remove that item from your pivot table. Now let's just come over here and make a copy of our pivot table. So we're just going to select everything, Control C, and let's head over to this new sheet here and let's just add in our pivot table, Control V. And let's take a look at how can we make this pivot table look a little nicer. So right now there's some numbers in there and they're kind of hard to read. We might want to add some thousands comma separators in there to format our numbers, and maybe some dollar signs as well. So how can we do that? We can format numbers in our pivot table pretty easily by selecting any cell in your numeric field and just right clicking and going to number format, and that's going to open up the format cells dialog box. And now there's a whole host of options available to format your numbers. So you can format them as a number, and you can add in a 1000 separator and increase or decrease decimal places there. And then you can also add in some different formatting for negative numbers here. In our case, we've got monthly salary figures, so we're going to use a currency here. And again, we're going to go with 0 decimal places, and then you can select which currency symbol you want to use. And then you can select how to display negative numbers here as well. So let's just choose that. And now we've got our numbers formatted in a currency format. And if we move around our pivot table, so if we shift things around and add something into our columns area, you can see that that formatting applies to the new shape of the pivot table. Now we might also want to change how this whole pivot table looks, and we can do that from the Design tab. So the Pivot Tables Tools Design tab. If you select any cell in your pivot table, you can go up to the Design tab, and here there's a whole section, Pivot Table Styles. And if you click on that, it's going to give you some options to style your pivot table. So there's a whole host of light, medium, and dark theme options here. And as you can see, it just like the Excel tables, it shows a little preview of what the style looks like on your pivot table before you actually select it. So we can select a style, and that's going to apply the style to our pivot table. And again, that's going to change whenever you update your pivot table. So I'm just going to move this back up here. And up in this Design tab, there's also some other options worth knowing. So here we have, you can add or remove grand totals. So right now we've got grand totals in our pivot table. So we've got grand totals in both the rows and columns. And you can come up here and you can turn them off. So you can turn off rows or column grand totals and turn on rows and column grand totals, or just turn on grand totals for rows only or for columns only. So whichever you prefer there. And we've also got subtotals. So if I add in a second field into my rows area, so let's try adding in marital status there. We can see that we've got subtotals at the department level, but we can also turn on or off those. We can choose to not show them or show them at the bottom or show them at the top like they were before. There's also some options here on how to lay out the format of your pivot table. So if we click on that and click on compact format, that's actually what we're viewing the pivot table in right now. That's the default. And that means anything that you put in the rows area is going to appear in one column. So you can see that my marital status is nested underneath my department. And if we go back into the Design tab, we also have some other options. So outline form, it's going to put those into separate columns. So now we've got our department out here, and nested underneath that we've got our marital status, but in a separate column. And then we can also go back, and the last option here is to show in tabular form. And it's very similar to the outline form. They're both in separate columns, but here they're on the same level, so you don't have them nested underneath each other. And I'm just going to go back into my compact form. So that's the basics of styling and formatting a pivot table. To format any numbers, just select one of the numbers and right click and format numbers. That's going to open up the Format Cells dialog box, and you can choose your formatting from there. And then also in the Pivot Table Tools Design tab, there's many options to style your pivot table here, as well as different layout options for your pivot table up here. Now that we've got our pivot table nicely formatted, let's figure out how we can change the summarization types going on in our values area. So I'm just going to make a copy of this, Control C, and we're going to head over to this tab here and Control V. So right now our pivot table is just summing up the data in the monthly salary column. But we can actually change that so that it does things like finds the minimum, maximum, counts things, or takes averages, and a couple other different calculation options. So to do that, we can either go into our pivot table fields window, and if we left click on that field in the values area, we have the option here to open up the value field settings. So if we click on that, it's going to open up this menu here, and here we can choose how we summarize our value field. So you can see right now it's selected the sum, and that's the default option for any numerical field that you put in the values area. But we can change that to count things, or take the average or the max or the min. So let's check out the average and press OK. And we can see that we now have an average value of our monthly salaries. So for example, the average human resource salary for a single person with a bachelor's education is $9,600. We can also access some of these options by right-clicking on any of the values and going to summarize values by, and then we get options for sum, count, average, max, min, and product. And we can also go to more options, and that's just going to bring up our value field settings again. And we also have a couple other different options here. So we have standard deviations and variances here as well. So I'm just going to cancel that, and I'm just going to get rid of this and change that into there. So right now we've just got the one version of our monthly salary field in here. I'm just going to widen this a bit. But we can add multiple versions of the same field, so we can drag the monthly salary field into our values area a couple times. And then we can right click and summarize, and we can choose different types of summarization for each of those if we want to. So right click, summarize, and maybe this one will have max and min there. And this way we can see different views of our monthly salary in the same pivot table. So now we can see the average, the count, the max, and the min of our monthly salary field. Now we can see that we've got some weird looking names here. So monthly salary 2 and monthly salary 3. We can actually rename these if we want to. So here we could just have average salary. And here maybe we just want count. And here max salary and min salary. So to rename any field heading, you can just simply type over it, and that's going to rename it. And you can see here that it also renames the field down here in our pivot table fields window. So you can easily keep track of things that way. Now let's just make another copy of this pivot table. So Control C, and let's head over to our pivot charts. So a pivot chart is basically going to allow us to take this pivot table and turn it into a chart. So how do we do that? Just select your pivot table, and up in the Analyze tab, Pivot Table Tools, Analyze tab, there's a button here for pivot charts. If we click on that, it's going to open up this Insert Chart dialog, and down here you have a whole load of options available. So we have column, line, pie, bar charts, area charts, etc. And then within each one of those, there's different options here along the top. And if you select them, you get a little preview of what that's going to look like. So let's just go back to our basic column chart and select that, press OK. And that's going to create this chart here. Pivot charts are kind of special charts because they're dynamically linked to our pivot table. So when I go back to my pivot table and change it in any sort of way, you can see that the pivot chart is being updated as well. So now we've just got our average salary listed in this pivot chart, and we have the different groupings for our departments, and then within each department the education level. So I'm just going to get rid of education level there, and department, and let's maybe put in job role there. And once we've got our pivot chart, so I don't like these labels here, we can actually go back into our design tab, and we can change the chart type if we want. So instead of a column chart for this kind of a thing, maybe a bar chart might work better. And that way we've got our job roles listed down here, and we can see them a little bit better. And we can customize this a little bit. So up in the design tab, there's some chart styles here that you can select. And we can also change the color palette available here. And we've got some quick layout options, so we can choose from those. And that's just going to add or remove different elements like titles and legends and things like that, and axes. And if there's a specific chart element we want to add, we can go up here into our add chart elements, and there's a whole list, so we can add axes, chart titles, data labels, etc. And of course we can do things in here, so if we don't like having this legend here, we can just select it and delete it as well. I'll remove it from the chart. And you can rename this here, so just select the title, and we can rename that to something like salary by department. Now in this pivot chart, we also have some buttons in here. So these allow us to filter our data, and we can just filter our chart and pivot table down to whatever elements in our fields that we need to. But I prefer to do any kind of filtering in the pivot table. So one trick is to right click on this, and if you select hide all field buttons, it's just going to remove those field buttons, and that's going to give you a little bit more real estate for your chart. Now I'm just going to select my pivot chart and press delete and get rid of it. And I want to show you a really quick way to add in a pivot chart. So when you select your pivot table, if you hold Alt and press F1 on your keyboard, that's going to create a simple column pivot chart for you. So that's a really quick shortcut for creating a pivot chart. So let's take our pivot table and make a copy of it again. So Control C and head down here and go to a new sheet and press Control V. And now let's take our pivot table and add a slicer to it. So a slicer is just a more user-friendly way to filter your data instead of using the sort and filter toggles up here. So to add a slicer to your pivot table, just select your pivot table and go up to the Analyze tab, and there's a section here, Filter section. If you press Insert Slicer, that's going to bring up this Insert Slicers dialog box, and all your fields are going to be listed here, so you can choose a couple if you want. So you can add in different slicers for different fields, and if you press OK, that's going to create your slicers here. So let's take a look at one of these. If we select one, we can move it out here, and let's move those guys off to the side. And you can resize these, so click on it and then you can move the edges around. And now when you select any of the buttons inside the slicer, that's going to filter down your pivot table data. So you can see there that I've just filtered now on my female employees, and now I'm just filtered on my male employees. And even though that field gender is not in my pivot table, I'm still filtering based on that field. Now you can add a slicer, so back in the Analyze tab and Insert Slicer. And in our case, we've got job role as a field in our pivot tables. So we can also add slicers for fields that are in our pivot table as well. And we can filter on that as well. And you can see there that now my pivot table only has laboratory technicians left in it since I'm filtered on that. But it's also still only filtered on male employees. So I can clear that filter out up here. And now with slicers, you can select more than just one item at a time. So if you click and drag, that's going to select multiple items. Or if you hold Control while you're selecting, that's also going to select multiple items for you. Now you can toggle on and off this multi-select option here, and that's going to allow you to select multiple items without using the Control key. Now I'm actually just going to delete these other two slicers, get rid of them. Now let's just add in a second pivot table here. So actually, if we make a copy of this pivot table, then that copy of the pivot table is also going to be connected to these two slicers here. So I'm just going to create a second independent pivot table. So I'm going to go up to the Insert tab and Pivot Table, and then I'm going to select my data. And if I just press Control A, that's going to select my whole table. And press OK. And let's just add some things in there. So maybe monthly salary into the values area. And let's add in department. And now you can see that when I play around with this slicer here, it's only this pivot table that's affected, and this one is not being filtered at the moment. But if I want to connect this pivot table to these two slicers, or just one of them, I can do that by going up to the Analyze tab with that pivot table selected and going to the Filter Connections option here. And we can see that there's two slicers available right now. So I got my gender slicer and my job role slicer, and both those are unchecked right now, which means they're not connected. So if you check those off and press OK, now you can see that my pivot table has been filtered down a little bit here. And that's because it's now connected to these two active slicers. So now you can see that when I filter and use my slicer, both pivot tables are being affected right now. So there I selected my pivot table first and went up to the Filter Connections, but you can select a slicer first and go into your Options, and there's Report Connections here, and then that's going to give you a list of all the pivot tables to connect to. So you can see here that I've got my two pivot tables checked off, and then the other pivot tables in this workbook are not connected to that slicer. So I'm going to cancel out of that. So we've got pivot tables and slicers, but where this really becomes powerful is when you add in pivot charts into the mix. So if we go up here and select our pivot table and back to our Analyze tab and Pivot Chart, and let's add in our bar chart here and press OK. Now, when you filter on that, it's going to affect the pivot table and it's going to affect the pivot chart. So here we can see that we're filtering down our pivot chart and pivot table. And you can probably tell that slicers and pivot charts are going to play a huge role in making interactive dynamic dashboards. So adding some slicers and some pivot charts, you're going to be able to filter down your data and visually see that filtered data. So now let's take everything that we've learned and use it to build a dynamic and interactive dashboard. So I'm just going to head over to my next sheet here, and I'm actually just going to create a new sheet and just double click on that and rename it. And this is where I'm going to have all of my pivot tables that I use to connect to pivot charts that I'm going to use in my dashboard. So I like to keep my pivot tables in a separate sheet and cut and paste those pivot charts that I connect to my pivot tables into my dashboard sheet. So first, let's just insert a new pivot table. And again, let's head over to our data and Control A to select the whole table. And the first thing we're going to look at is gender. And we're also just going to add gender into the values area, and it'll default to a count of gender since it's a text field. And then we're going to create a pivot chart based on this. So let's go into our Analyze tab and Pivot Chart. And we're going to have a simple pie chart for this. And the option I like up here is this donut chart. It's a little bit more modern, so let's select that. And then I'm just going to Control X to cut that chart. And I'm going to paste it in my dashboard sheet there. And now I'm going to create a copy of this. And over here, just paste it. And the next one we're going to look at is average salary by experience. So we're going to remove gender. I'm just going to close that out. And in the rows area, we're going to add in this total working years. So basically their experience. And I'm going to remove count of gender, and we'll add in monthly salary there. And instead of the sum, what we're going to do is left click and change that in the value field settings. And we're going to take the average. And now we're going to create a pivot chart. So back in the Analyze tab, let's add in a pivot chart. And for this one, we're going to do a line chart. And press OK. And then again, let's just Control X to cut that and paste it in here somewhere. And let's make one last copy. So Control C and Control V. And we're just going to have 3 charts in our dashboard. So this will be the last one. And for this one, let's take a look at our employee age. And then we're also going to take a count. So we can leave this count of gender in. So we're just counting our employees by different ages. And let's go to the Analyze tab and Pivot Chart for that. And this one we'll use a column chart. And we can press OK. And again, Control X. And let's head over into our dashboard and Control V. And now let's clean some of these charts up a little bit. So we don't need this legend here. It's kind of useless. And same with this one here. And let's just give these some more descriptive titles. So let's say this one is employees by age. And here we've got employees by gender. And we've also got average salary by experience. And let's also just get rid of all these buttons. So let's right click and hide all field buttons. Right click, hide all field buttons. And I'm just going to change the design of this one here. So I'm going to go to my quick layouts, and I'm just going to choose this layout here. So it's a slightly thicker donut, and it's also got the legend or just below the title. And I'm also going to change the color. So I like this one. And I'm going to match those others with the same color palette. And I've got this legend here, and right now it's got no formatting on the numbers. So I'm just going to go to that pivot table and right click and format those numbers. And I'll give them a currency with no decimal places and press OK. And that's going to format those numbers there for me. Now the other thing I'm going to do here is, so this pie chart has some labels on it, so we can clearly see that this is 40% of the pie and male is 60% of the pie. I'm just going to make that a little bit bigger. So I'm going to increase the font size here in the Home tab. And I'm also going to change the font color there to a white. And there we go. Those are looking a little nicer now than the defaults. So now that I've got these, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in a couple slicers that we can interact with all these charts. So I'm just going to select one of these and go into my Analyze tab and insert slicers. And for this dashboard, we're just going to have education level and department and job role as slicers. And now we just got to connect each of these. So these three slicers, they're only connected to this one pivot chart. So I'm going to go and right click on the first one and report connections. And here's my three pivot tables that my pivot charts are based on. So they're in the pivot tables sheet. So I can select those three and press OK. And same with this one, right click and report connections. And again, select just the ones in my pivot table sheet. And right click and report connections. And get those guys as well. So now we've got three slicers, and each of them will be filtering all our pivot charts. And let's just quickly change the default style of these slicers. So I'm going to select them all by holding Control and clicking on each of them. And if we go up to the Options tab, and we can select a different style from here. I'm going to give it this dark style. And now our dashboard has all the elements that we are looking for in our dashboard, but it's not looking so good right now. So it's not aligned at all and everything's kind of a mess. So I'm going to select all the elements, so the slicers and the charts, and I can do that by just selecting one of the objects, and if I press Control A, that's going to select them all. And I can go into my options, and here in the Arrange section, if I select a line, I'm going to select this Snap to Grid option. And what that's going to do is it's going to allow me to align my charts and slicers easily. Because now they're going to align perfectly with the cells in my workbook. So Snap to Grid allows you to snap them to the cells in your workbook. So I'm just going to make a little border here and right click on the first column and column width and make that a bit smaller. And then I'm just going to align these guys up here. So And I'm just going to make this guy the same width, 3. And I'm going to have this chart go all the way across. And these two charts will be at the top here. So quick and easy way to align all your objects in your dashboards. Just use Snap to Grid. So select your objects and go to the Options tab and Arrange and Snap to Grid. And one last trick. So right now I can still move these around. If I select my slicers holding Control and right click and go to Size and Properties, then in the Position and Layout section, there's an option here to disable resizing and moving. So if I select that, now I can't select and move my slicers, but I can still interact with them and use them. And then a couple last things that I'm just going to do to make this look a little bit nicer. I'm just going to select the last column here. Actually, I'm just going to change this one column width, and I'll go with 3 again there. Then I'm going to select the last column and hold Control Shift and press right. That's going to select everything. And then I'm just going to hide all those columns. So right click and hide. And I'm going to do the same thing with the rows. So I'm going to select the last row and Control Shift and down. And right click and hide those guys. And that's just going to give us a nice defined area so that we know there's nothing beyond that in our dashboard sheet. So there we go. We've managed to take our raw data in Excel and turn it into an interactive dashboard. Now, if you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit the thumbs up button and subscribe to the channel for future Excel videos like this one. That's it for this video. See you in the next one.